What are some things that couples can do to be proactive in their relationship about stopping arguments before they start?
Well,
That
that's very
is,
broad.
Oh,
it's broad and it's very important. And there's a lot written about that in the couples world. I can think just generally, I mean, obviously some of it has to do with what each individual brings, right? You know, people with, for example, with a history of trauma, their way of their reason for escalating is different from a person who is, let's say, more entitled or narcissistically loaded, and their reason for escalation would be very different. So I mean, we can get into that if you want to, but if I had to say something very broad about escalation, one of the things that people learn in couples work are a few things. One is the business of what we call in jargon affect modulation, which basically means you learn to look inward, notice what emotional state are you in, um, and you know that if there's a certain kind of zone within which arguing and fighting is still productive, but beyond that it's not productive anymore. It's either a waste of time or destructive. So one of the things we teach people to do is to look inward and see where you're at in terms of like your level of excitation or upset. And if you're going beyond a certain level, either it's time to stop talking, or figure out a way to bring yourself down, you know, with like basic tactics like pay attention to your heart rate, breathing, ground yourself, take a pause, think about the bigger picture, just bring yourself down. So I guess the same way you would do if you're like, I don't know, running and your heart is going crazy. Um, the other um, area to focus on to prevent escalation is to pay close attention to whether you're in the mode of talking and trying to make your point versus listening and trying to understand what your partner is saying. And really make sure you're engaging more in listening and less in talking. That will immediately completely change the dynamic. So those are the main two things that I would say in general to prevent escalation. And then I would dig into like more specifically what is causing people to escalate.
I have a question. In scenario one, you mentioned how you thought it could be a strategy problem, and then in scenario three, you said it's a systemic problem.
Mhm.
Do you identify the type of problem first and then do that affect modulation where you look inward, or do you do the reverse?
In terms of how I work with couples,
Or in terms of how we could think to de-escalate a fight, like do you say identify what kind of like this is
oh,
which one comes first? Is it
affect modulation is always key,
okay?
always, always, because that first of all, it's actually relatively easy to do once you get the hang of it, and it's always important. So that I would start with both affect modulation and then kind of figuring out like this knowing when you're listening and when you're talking. I mean, you're actually using different parts of your brain when you do that. Um, so those two things are always important, and I would recommend if people are like trying to do something with what we're saying here, do that. Do those two things. Things are gonna look different. And then delving into like more systemic, deeper issues of like what is really causing the escalation here? Is someone getting triggered by some past event? Are they just entitled and feeling like they just have to have their way? That's hard to treat.
I would think, does the desire to be right usually trump listening?
Yeah, the desire to be right is a strong one. All of us suffer from that. Um, if it's just that, if it's not coming from like deep narcissistic issues, it's okay. People learn how to reflect on that, laugh at that, at their own need to be right. It's not that hard to overcome that.
That's good.
No, I like that.
That's hugely helpful.
Yeah, I'm like taking this all, and I'm like, I have so many tools on how to have a better relationship in the future.
Yeah,
Great.
that was so helpful.
Yes.